The Defence Secretary has been accused of cheating over claims that more money is being spent on the armed forces. In an ill-tempered Defence Select Committee hearing, Conservative and Labour MPs joined forces in a surprise attack on Grant Shapps. They suggested that he was misleading ministers and the public over investment in the services, claims he strongly denied as he provided evidence to defend his position. Meanwhile, we're being told the UK would run out of ammunition and equipment in less than 2 months in a war against Putin's Russia. Joining me in the studio now, Defence Editor of the Evening Standard, Robert Fox. Thank you for coming, Robert. And down the line, we're joined by retired General Tim Cross, who commanded one of the 3 divisions of the UK Field Army and Chief Political Correspondent at the Times Aubrey Allegretti. I think we might start with Aubrey to set the political scene and just explain how unusual it is to have Labour and Conservative MPs united in mounting an attack on the Defence Secretary in this way. Ill-tempered is one word to describe, or one hyphenated word, 2 hyphenated together to describe what was going on. But there are many others one could use to describe that rather vicious, bile-fueled altercation, aren't there?
It certainly is quite strange to see both Labour and Conservative MPs sort of turning their fire, if you like to use the military speak, on the Defence Secretary in this way. And I think it reflects a sort of growing cross-party frustration that the government has set out its ambition to raise defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, which, it has to be pointed out, is above the NATO target of 2%, which some other countries don't in and of themselves meet. But that Rishi Sunak, as somebody who held the purse strings and was Chancellor and is now Prime Minister, hasn't yet sort of let the sort of moment happen where we're going to be able to reach that big sort of new landmark piece of spending. I travelled with the Prime Minister to San Diego last year, where it was announced that as part of the integrated review, which is effectively the government's 10-year defence and security strategy, it was going to try and raise defence spending to this level. And so for nearly a year now, we've had people becoming frustrated and saying, well, when is the sort of magic moment that is going to arrive when this money is going to be granted to us? Because here we are, nearly close to the general election, and it hasn't happened yet. And as the former Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, has pointed out on numerous occasions, it's cheaper to prevent war than to engage into it afterwards.
Let me bring Tim Cross into this conversation. Tim, feelings running very high, and normally we say on both sides, but this seems to be one side, all united against Grant Shapps. The word cheating used, a very strong word, but is he, do you think, inflating the amount of money being spent on defence? Is he somehow double-crossing us? What's going on?
Well, first of all, I should say, for 7 years, I was the Army advisor to the House Commons Defence Committee, so I spent many happy hours preparing for these briefings and sitting in on them.
Yes. And
I watched the briefing yesterday, actually, because I was quite interested in what Grant Shapps would have to say. And notwithstanding the earlier comments, I would say that it was quite, some quite strong language being used, but I wouldn't say it was vicious or anything. I mean, I would offer that this is a very important part of our democracy. We have these committees to hold the government to account. And the members of those committees, generally speaking, I only know it from the Defence Committee, but I can say with absolute no hesitation at all that these guys do not hold their party lines in these debates. They try to get to the bottom of what's happening in defence. Now, the numbers that were being talked about yesterday, and there were people from the civil service that were there yesterday presenting some of these numbers, are always notoriously difficult to get underneath. But my sense was that the committee were right to hold Grant Shapps to account, in that the way he was presenting these figures did overplay what was being spent on UK defence, because involved in the debate was how much of this is going to Ukraine and other things too. So I think it was a good debate. I was glad to see it. Strong language being used, but nonetheless holding government to account. Grant Shapps having to really work hard to defend himself, and the committee trying to get underneath what's actually going on.
Do you think, Robert, your valiant endeavours, our valiant endeavours, and the valiant endeavours of everybody else mean that, I know we're not really responsible, but we've certainly had a good bash at doing this, mean that there is a general awakening to the need for defence to be taken seriously, the need for proper investment in the armed forces, etc.? Is this a concerted push against Grant Shapps part of a sort of enlightenment that's finally dawning?
I think there is a change of mood, and I say that very mildly.
We've got a bit of a problem with your mic. We'll sort you out, Robert, in a second, and then so I better go back to. I'll go back to Tim Cross because he spent so much time in these committees that he'll know. Do you think that finally there is some kind of understanding or awakening to the fact that we need to rev up defence? That the notion of war isn't some kind of far away, fantastical prospect, but it looks as if there's every chance that something could erupt and it could happen.
Yeah, I do. And I have to say, it's not often I hear Robert without hearing his voice. So it's nice to see him, but it's a shame I didn't want to hear him. But yes, definitely, this is winding up. There's no doubt about it. And the earlier comments about that this has been talked about now for a year. Other nations within NATO are increasing their defence spending, particularly places like Poland. Germany have announced some pretty large figures, the Baltic states and so on. So yeah, we have talked about this for quite a while. To be fair, the government last year did put more money into defence. But this move to 2.5% or indeed 3%, which has been spoken about, because we're living in this period, which some people are saying is like the 1930s, a sort of pre-war period. And as has been said before, spending money on defence now is important if you want to show firm deterrence and avoid having to fight a war, which would be very costly, not just in money terms, but in people, obviously. And we need the money now because one of the other things that was debated was if we do end up by fighting a war with Russia, we do not have the sustainability to conduct enduring, long-term, sustainable war-fighting operations, as in, several months of fighting. The figure was quoted, I think, yesterday, that after about 2 months, we would begin to run out of ammunition and so on. So the sustainable logistic stocks we need to build up on need money now. They need contracts now from people like BAE Systems and others.
Yes. Let me bring Robert into this. We can hear you now loudly and clearly, I'm glad to say. So you hear this altercation going on. What are your thoughts? Are you glad it's happening at least?
Well, I'm glad it's happening.
Front page.
And it's very complimentary of you to say valiant efforts, but it's got absolutely nowhere. Come on, Tim Cross knows very well, and so does my colleague from the political staff. It's a game of smoke and mirrors. This wonderful lauded figure, aren't we great? We're the leader in Europe. We spend over 2% of GDP on defence. Well, a lot of that 2% that gets us over the 2% or on the 2% is for welfare, for pensions, even Korean War pensions. Come on, there has been a game about it. And I think there is a collusion between the two parties here that they know damn well, and for a very good reason I'll come on to in a minute. Now, defence and security will come into the debate in the election campaign, and neither wants it. And it comes into the campaign because Ukraine is losing. Ukraine this summer faces defeat, whether it's critical or decisive, or even catastrophic, because that's going to affect us all. And I'm afraid, I know Tim Cross very well, admire him very much, but I don't think we've got the time that the advisors and so on are telling us. Things are really about to go very critical. You don't want to alarm the public, but the trouble is, Vanessa, there's a paradox here.
Yes.
The moment you alarm the public saying, you are really in trouble, you are really in trouble, if you see what I mean. And you're in a very difficult situation. We're on the cusp of that at the moment.
Yes, let me bring Tim Cross back in to respond to that. I mean, when you hear Robert Fox, an eminent and distinguished expert, say Ukraine is going to lose, I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm suspecting that people watching and listening to this programme feel a kind of tightening in the throat, a kind of, revving of a pulse, and feel worried, sick about what the permutations and repercussions could be, not just for Ukrainians, of course, but for us, because there's self-interest always at the heart of every response. So what do you think about what Robert has said? A, is he right? B, if it happens, then what?
Yeah, I think he's right. I mean, I did say, Robert, that we need to start spending this money now, and we need contracts now. So I agree with you entirely. This does need to be, dealt with today. We can't wait for the result of a general election, or indeed to wait for the results of the presidential election. Now, Vanessa, I think I said on your programme last week, but I've certainly said on a couple of others, I am worried about Ukraine. Now, Robert's using some pretty strong language there about the potential catastrophe and so on. But there is no doubt that Ukraine is on the defensive, and that they are struggling, I think, to maintain those defences. They need the materiel stocks and so forth that the West has promised, but it's taking an awful long time to arrive. And they are certainly not in any position to conduct any counter-offensive of all arms offensive operations and so on. So there's a real danger that in the spring, the Russians will be able to put more pressure on Ukraine and could potentially break through. There's no doubt about that.
And then what? If that happens, then what happens?
Well, if it happens, we've got two choices. We either find that we have to help them hold the line somewhere else, or we have to acknowledge and accept that there will then be some formal negotiated settlement, which could put Ukraine, well, will put Ukraine in a very difficult position, and will put NATO in a difficult position. I mean, I don't go along with people like Macron saying we're going to start putting boots on the ground in Ukraine. I just don't think that's going to happen. But if Ukraine were to fall, then it would give Putin the confidence and all the rest of it to start putting pressure in places like the Baltic with the Baltic states, but also in places like the Balkans and their support for Serbia and what's going on in places like Kosovo. It will just invigorate Putin, and I think he will then try to continue to ramp up the pressure on us in the West generally.
If this is about to happen, does that mean that we and our fellows in NATO and around the world have mishandled this chronically, that we haven't responded with enough alacrity, with enough money, with enough weapons, just we have not realised, or we have and we've kind of allowed it to happen?
I think with alacrity, I think that we have been casual in a way. We could manage it in the same way. We have not put together, as Tim would recognise, a coherent strategy, build up, build up, build up. And the people that are advising of this, because they are on the front line, are the Baltics, but also the Finns, newly joined Sweden, and Norway. Norway, the Finns, the Poles are on the front line. They say, look, it is really coming. And following the attack in the Crocus City Concert Hall, remember the rhetoric of Putin. Putin was not saying just Ukraine. We are against the neo-Nazi West, as he put it. And it is a major confrontation which we have to address through our allies. Britain is regarded, particularly by our northern allies, and fun enough, countries like Italy, who really want to help out in the East Mediterranean, and we've got to step up with it, because your point is absolutely right. We have vital interests. We have a big stake in maritime trade worldwide. We are a very big player still, but these connections are absolutely vital for communications, energy, but above all, food.
All right, let's bring Aubrey Allegretti back into this. No, you don't need to be sorry, not at all. I just wanted to respond because, Aubrey, what's being said by Tim and by Robert is enough to make your blood run cold. I mean, it really is, and it sounds believable, credible, imminent, and exceptionally worrying. What is the political appetite? And at the moment, it's Rishi Sunak at the centre of all of this. What is the political appetite for addressing this, for funding this, for strategizing quickly, because we need, as we've just said, alacrity. We don't need to be casual, nonchalant, let this play itself out. We need presumably to orchestrate some kind of intervention that might either delay it or somehow ameliorate it if we possibly can. In other words, we need to get cracking on this, it's quite obvious. But is there any political appetite to? Is there the will to? We've got a general election at some point soon. Is this something that's going to be kicked into the long grass, which doesn't sound as if it's something we could afford to do?
I think there's really a sort of difference of opinion stretching back over the last 10 years about how the UK should have responded to Russian aggression in the broadest sense. And when you think back, for example, to Russia's annexing of Crimea in 2014, there were certainly lots of people who think that the Conservative government wasn't sort of strong enough. It didn't escalate to de-escalate, i.e. Try and step in and take a very firm line in order to calm tensions down, fearing that to do so would only inflame the situation even more. And I think there's a lot of soul searching about whether or not the right kind of lessons have been learned from the UK's response over the last 10 years on that front. When it comes to the election, though, and the sort of views and perceptions of the wider electorate, it doesn't feel, when you look at the polling, that the issue of Ukraine or sort of global security or insecurity polls particularly highly amongst the sort of salience of voters at the election. But that's not to say that the ramifications or implications of a sort of Ukrainian defeat wouldn't be particularly stark and sharp in minds. So thinking particularly of the energy crisis that happened in the aftermath of Russia's full-scale invasion, the access to grain that we saw depleted, and that the implications for sort of domestic food security, as well as other kind of economic supply chains. All of those kind of issues, I think, would be much more front of mind with voters were they to happen. The trouble really is politicians politicians convincing them that it is worth spending all of this money over other pieces of money. We're looking at other public services and saying the NHS might need money, schools might need money, but you have to really convince voters that it's defence that is worthwhile taking more money than another political priority that voters might value more highly for now.
Let me bring Robert back in, because you were nodding, I think, approvingly to some of that. Does it have to be presented in a particular way to voters, or really is it just, oh my God, that Ukraine might lose and then what the hell happens?
I think Aubrey has presented the dilemma absolutely brilliantly.
Well, that's why we have him on the show.
Very,
It's brilliant. That's why we have you all on the show, because you're all brilliant.
But the question is, with these opinion polls, with these focus groups, and it's been half my life in journalism that I've done that. When the Independent started writing leaders according to the taste of what its focus groups were saying, it's a leader written by a focus group, Aubrey. It's a question of whether you're going to be a leader or a follower. And if you're in charge, you've got to lead opinion if you detect that your nation, your community is in crisis, is in danger. You can't follow. And you're absolutely right in terms of following. Defence comes, 7% of priorities in continuing opinion polls. I was looking at some recently, but you can't say, wake up and smell the coffee, because you'll be accused of frightening the horses. But if you really frighten the horses, the horses have bolted. It's happened,
absolutely.
And it's probably too late.
Let me bring Tim Cross in just for the final word on this, sir, if you wouldn't mind. What is the thought that you'd like to leave us with on this? Grant Shapps, accused of cheating, and the imminent prospect of a Ukrainian defeat, and also mingled in our minds with the general election forthcoming. It's a hideous, chaotic muddle, really, isn't it?
Well, it is to some degree, but we need to keep a balance in this, and we need not to, get overly excited. But I mean, Robert's put his finger absolutely on the point. This is down to leadership, and I'm afraid one of my mantras of my own life at the moment, I run my own company, is morally courageous leadership. That's what we need. Absolutely. And we need statesmen and stateswomen who are prepared to stand up and convince people that this is a serious situation. Now, lots of people are talking about this, but you then come back to the earlier point: is talk is not enough at this stage. We need to see the resources being put in to enable us to take the actions that we may need to take in the near to middle distant future. So
somebody's got to say the equivalent of Houston, we have a problem.
Houston, we have a problem. OK, well, you've just said it. All right, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Terrifying but fascinating as ever.